Now we will move on to the next panel. So for those of you who just joined, I'm Gaidar, I'm Acronis Chief Cyber Officer, and I'm your host for today. Here's a quick overview for the agenda till the end of the day, till the end of the event today. And with that, I want to go forward and introduce your host for the next panel, James Slaby. So James is the Director of Cyber Protection at Acronis, and he works with our partners to create marketing programs, business development programs. He speaks at different events. He hosts events like this. So it's actually his job to host these events. I'm just stepping in to help him. And James is a former industry analyst. He worked in many famous analyst firms like Forrester, and he has multiple publications, and he's really a security expert on our team. So over to you, Jim.
Thank you, Gaidar. Before we get to our amazing panel that we have for you to talk about NIST, I wanted to do a little bit of table setting. You may be familiar with this set of issues that we've outlined before about how SMBs in particular get short shrift from the cybersecurity vendor community. They don't generally have the resources that they need, and most of the vendors tend to focus on the richer enterprises who are better staffed, have the budget, and have greater priorities around things like compliance. So they basically follow the money there, and it leaves SMBs out in the dark. That, from our perspective, of course, that's a tremendous opportunity for our MSP partners to give them the attention to bring the capabilities to them of cyber protection across the board that they're not getting from the market overall. So our panel is going to talk about the NIST cybersecurity framework. I wanted to just give you a kind of a NIST 101 for our attendees who aren't completely familiar with it. This is a cybersecurity framework that it originated out of the United States government. President Obama directed the feds to come up with a set of cybersecurity standards that could be adopted across government and across commercial industry as well. The standards body published their first framework a year later. Even President Trump has endorsed it and encouraged the US federal government to continue conforming to the NIST standard. Why do we bother with standards? Well, I think our first panel did a really good job of outlining the incredible breadth and complexity and growing nature of the cybersecurity threats out there. And if you want to adapt to this kind of environment, it helps to have a kind of a programmatic framework to assess your risk posture, periodically revisit it, and measure yourself against a kind of an architecture. It's basically a lens to look at your cybersecurity environment as it relates to your overall risk assessment strategy for the business, how it relates to how you deliver critical business services and improve continuously. So the 5 phases of it are pretty straightforward, and it's one of the things that I value about this particular framework compared to others, is that it's fairly straightforward superficially and pretty easy to understand. And as we'll talk about, that we think that makes it a very useful tool for you to explain your capabilities from a cyber protection standpoint in a way that the typical frazzled, understaffed, harried small to medium business will be able to grasp. So we start with the identify function, which is basically about understanding the lay of the land, how your tech assets map to the business services that you're delivering, basically understanding where your tech measures up against your overall risk management strategy. So that can include, the identify function can include things like developing and disseminating the company's risk management policy, but it also comes down to technical pieces like inventorying your data, understanding where all your data is located throughout the organization. Protect is basically trying to fend off threats before they happen. So this is any measure that you put in place that is about stopping cybersecurity events before they happen. So that could be something like your security information and event management system, your big dashboard for monitoring security events from all across your company. But it's also something more programmatic, more people-oriented, like security awareness training, teaching your employees to be wary of emails, opening attachments or clicking on links from people they don't absolutely trust, since that's still one of the most popular malware attack vectors. The detection piece is what it says. It's about identifying that cybersecurity threats are actually happening right away. So there's a number of ways that you implement detect in your cybersecurity framework. Behavioral threat response is a typical one. So if you've got anti-malware capabilities that are able to identify threats by their behavior, you're doing one good piece of the work that you need to do from a detect standpoint. Respond is what you do when a cybersecurity event has actually happened. So these are things like putting together an incident response plan. It's also about things like patch management. So you know in the wake of an event that you need to close vulnerabilities that are out there. Recovery, of course, is the last phase. It's how you mop up after you've suffered a cybersecurity incident. So this might include things like the restoral part or the recovery part of your backup and disaster recovery. You might also include forensics in this, figuring out what exactly you did wrong, what you left open that led to the attack so that you can fix it for future purposes. So it's a nice, simple framework. It encompasses the length and breadth of what we might do from a cybersecurity standpoint in people, process, and technology. And there's a good chance that your typical SMB is never going to be in a position to implement this kind of a framework, but you can do it on their behalf. And we think frameworks are kind of a useful way for you to explain what you're doing. I don't want to spend too much time on this because we'll talk about this in a little bit. But this is an example of how, for example, we would map some of the functions of Acronis Cyber Protect Cloud onto the NIST framework. So you think about things like putting together a data protection map as part of the identify function. The protect might be your behavioral anti-malware agent that you've got installed on all endpoints and servers. Detection using artificial intelligence enhanced monitoring of your hard drives to be able to identify when they fail. And in general, your dashboard, your monitoring of your environment is part of the detect function. Response, the idea of responding to recovery restoral from backup images that you've already installed patches to, and recovery, flipping the switch on your disaster recovery capability and being able to resume operations that way. Again, we think you ought to be thinking about NIST not just in terms of how it can help your own organization get more programmatic about how you are protecting your own infrastructure, but also as a way to help your customers and prospects for cyber protection services understand the world, understand what you're delivering for them, helping them to move what in NIST parlance is to a better readiness tier. So NIST has this concept of implementation tiers, and you're ranked from 1 to 4. If you're in tier 1, you're very reactive. You're not implementing security tech and policies consistently across the board. You're generally in reactive mode. If you get to a risk-informed tier 2, you're doing a little bit better. You're making your employees more aware of what's going on. You're mapping your infrastructure to your risk assessment strategy, your risk management strategy better, but you're not quite as proactive as you could be. So the repeatable and the adaptive tiers Tiers 3 and 4 are the ultimate goal of NIST, is to help you get to the point where you can actually anticipate threats. So again, NIST provides another tool here, I think, that is a valuable way of articulating how you can help your customers. Say, look, you're in tier 1 right now. You're basically kind of reacting to threats rather than anticipating them. With our help, we can move you up into that more risk-aware tier and iteratively help you get to a point where you're really anticipating threats, really preserving great uptime, and keeping your sensitive data and your customers' data secure. All right, with that, I want to introduce our panel here. They are kind of seriously impressive. I'm kind of a little bit in awe of their accomplishments. Let me first say I'm honored to welcome Clare Satchwell. She's the head of product and marketing for Vuzion, which is a leading UK cloud aggregator that sprang from Cobweb, which you may know is a leading UK MSP. Clare owns a product and marketing strategy across Cobweb and Vuzion and is responsible for launching new processes, products, and services, among which are Cobweb and Vuzion's new marketplace platforms. He was a pioneer in building the first set of offerings on Microsoft Azure. That's amazing, which won the Cloud Blue Hyperscale Platform 2018 Award for Innovation and Growth. Welcome, Clare.
Well, that's quite an introduction, but I can assure you it's very much a team effort.
Yes, yes. It's humility in those kind of things is excellent. Of course, you know, when there are issues, you're the boss, right? I'm also pleased to welcome William Despard to the panel. He's the Managing Director for Africa at Technovate, which is another big leading UK-based MSP, having amassed more than 30 years of experience in the IT industry, including 18 years in InfoSec. William has extensive knowledge of the retail, financial services, and insurance industry, government, IT service providers, oil and gas, telecoms, and manufacturing. Maybe easier to say what industries he doesn't know something about. He also has an astonishing list of project leadership accomplishments across many security disciplines, most recently in the case of GDPR compliance, pet project of mine, risk assessment, and not coincidentally, cybersecurity frameworks. Thanks for coming, William.
Thank you, James. Thanks for inviting me.
We've also, as our third panelist, is the estimable Candid Wuest, Acronis' Vice President for Cyber Protection Research, where he researches new threat trends and comprehensive protection methods. Candid previously worked for more than 16 years as the tech lead for Symantec's Global Security Response Team. No small accomplishment there. Wuest has published a book and many white papers and is frequently cited as a security expert in tier 1 media outlets. Frequent speaker at security conferences like the RSA conference in Area 41, and serves as an advisor to the Swiss federal government on cyber risks, my old job. No, that's not true. That's all Candid. Last but hardly least, we welcome back Richard Tubb. If you don't know Richard, he had his own MSP business for 8 years before becoming a renowned advisor to MSPs on issues like business growth, service pricing, marketing, and operational efficiencies. He publishes the widely read Tubb blog and the popular podcast Tubb Talk, both of which provide advice to IT consultancies. Welcome, Richard. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you.
All right, let's jump into our questions here. My first question is, what do you consider to be the advantages of NIST over the other cybersecurity frameworks you may know? I know some of you have experience with ISO 27000 and a BSI IT baseline projection manual. So what's your take on NIST relative to each of these? William, why don't we start with you? I know that you've got some background across a range of cybersecurity frameworks.
Yeah, I've traditionally spent a lot of time with ISO 27001, but you know, from my perspective, a key consideration for picking a framework it always involves understanding the level of context each framework offers, since it's going to impact the available security and privacy controls that exist out of the box without having to bolt on content, in order to be able to make it work for your specific needs. And what's great, what I think is great about the NIST cybersecurity framework is it doesn't introduce any new concepts or standards, but it leverages and integrates industry-leading cybersecurity practices that have been developed by organizations like NIST and ISO. And so it compromises a risk-based compilation of guidelines that helps organizations identify, implement, and improve cybersecurity practices and create a common language for internal and external communication. So in a nutshell, the ability to leverage NIST for SMB environment is there, and MSP should try and take advantage of it.
That's fascinating. Candid, you got some comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, all of those different frameworks, right, being it the BSI in Germany or ENISA or the ISO, they of course all improve your security posture, right? So I'd say using any of them is definitely better than using none. But in my opinion, the ISO standard is a bit more focused on the risk aspect, whereas the NIST cybersecurity framework is more on the best practice side, which makes it easier to apply. And I definitely like the simple structure of the NIST cyber framework. I mean, you mentioned the 5 function. There's also a lot of documentation available, making it easier to probably apply if you don't know what's going on. And last but not least, I definitely love as well the common language that William also mentioned, which allows you to talk about how to manage risk, right? It helps an organization to ask, but also answer the correct and right questions, like what are we doing today, let's say, to protect against service outage? Where do we want to be in 6 months? And the additional benefit that this generates is it allows you to bridge the gap between the technical people and the business side stakeholders, which always helps.
That's great stuff. I think I'm going to move on from this question in the interest of time here. We've got quite a bit of material to cover, and I know we're going to have a bunch of questions from the audience. So let me ask, you know, NIST came up with a publication last October that spurred a lot of discussion internally at Acronis. And just from the title, you can tell why: improving cybersecurity of MSPs supporting SMBs. That's kind of our wheelhouse. What do you think? I assume you've all read the document. For attendees, there's a link to it on your screen there. What do you think of the document? What should be the key takeaways for our MSP partners and other attendees here today? Richard, you want to take a whack at that?
Sure. So I've read the white paper, James, but I wonder how many of MSP partners are actually aware of it. So kudos to you know, Acronis for raising awareness of this. There is a tendency for MSPs to try and reinvent the wheel. This is no knock on anybody, but I work with lots of MSPs globally, and they tend to think that they are unique, that the problems they're facing, that nobody else is facing. And the reality check as a former MSP myself is, you know, these type of documents can really help. So why reinvent the wheel? I'd encourage MSPs to check this out. And I think my key takeaway from it would be, obviously there is a ton of guidance. There's a ton of practical advice in there. But my key takeaway is really for MSPs to realize they don't have to do this alone. This is a very complex subject. There are organizations like NIST who are doing the heavy lifting of the research and the compilation of the research, so MSPs can benefit from it. And what's more, this is aimed at MSPs who are supporting small and medium-sized businesses. So if you're an MSP watching this, and previously you've looked at a standard, some of the other standards we've mentioned, and you've perhaps been scared away because it's been aimed at the enterprise level, the NIST model is not like that. It's aimed at the SMB space. So I'd encourage everybody to check it out.
Yeah, everyone needs a little bit of a helping hand in these interesting times. Claire, do you have any thoughts about the document? What might be useful to come out of it for our attendees?
Yeah, sorry, I agree with Richard about awareness of the document itself, but it's something I'm very familiar with. The NIST framework is often written off by small businesses who have assumed that it's really focused on and aimed at government and enterprise-sized businesses, or that in fact it's only applicable to those in the US. And that's certainly not the case. The publication demonstrates the commitment to SMBs and MSPs by NIST. It's also really, really, really good to see a document like this that is a manageable length and is very easy to understand. So the scenario-based approach that's featured in it is really relatable, and therefore it's a great place to start. It's not frightening in any way. There's a really good example of segmented and non-segmented networks, and this clearly demonstrates how you can reduce risk by understanding your infrastructure and ultimately taking a modular approach. But the key takeaway for me is that confirmation that both MSPs and small businesses are often facing the same challenge.
I have to concur with your comment about the readability of it. It's really quite refreshing. If you've been on the vendor product side like I have for years and had some connection to the standards world, you can know how some of the documentation, the publications can seem just like utter confusing gobbledygook. So it's a refreshing bit of clear language and actionable kind of intelligence, I think, in that particular document. And it sort of informs this notion of this is a framework that SMBs who would never consider having the means to implement a security framework can actually grasp and understand. Obviously, it goes levels. If you're a cybersecurity framework expert like we have on this panel, you know that you can go really kind of deep with it. But just to gain that kind of initial grasp of what you ought to be doing, I think it's tremendous. All right, let's move on here. We've been hitting on this for a while here because obviously Acronis is a big believer in NIST as a kind of a framework, as an educational tool, potentially a marketing tool. I was curious to ask the panel, what's your take on that? Maybe Richard, maybe I'll go to you again on this with your MSP background.
Yeah, sure. So let's be honest, James, you know, this is an opportunity for MSPs to help their clients to raise standards. You know, as a former MSP myself, I know that clients are notorious at not taking advice unless they're forced to. We can see that with GDPR. So I know there's going to be lots of MSPs watching today who are like, well, I've given this advice to my clients and they've just not listened. You know, standards are a great way to reinforce to clients that, hey, this is not my opinion. This is something that has been researched and there is the best practice behind it. GDPR was a great example of that, that forced SMBs to take action on advice that MSPs have been giving them for a long, long time. I also think that SMB clients' awareness of cybersecurity is now higher than ever. And so MSPs adopting something like the NIST framework, something that's independent and created for the benefit of businesses, is something that SMBs will actually welcome and, you know, be all ears to. Of course, most SMBs are a long way from meeting the recommendations of the NIST framework. So it's a golden opportunity for MSPs to go in there and talk about projects that can help their clients to shore up their cybersecurity. Ironically, by implementing those projects to help clients shore up their cybersecurity, it's actually going to lower the MSP's cost of supporting their clients. So we're talking about increased profit as well. So.
Sorry, James, if I may leap in, actually, I think one of the other things that it actually does is it really helps as well get those projects over the line. Because if you're in the senior leadership team and you're being presented with a project that has a cost and a risk but no kind of guarantees, having that absolute confidence by something central and independent can quite often be the final piece that actually can turn it from a proposal into a project. So I think that's absolutely key.
Great advice.
That's fantastic. William, want to throw in a comment here?
I firmly agree with what Richard and Claire have been saying. MSPs themselves need to look internally at improving their own cybersecurity programs. That's important to their success and the success of the SMBs. The support that the MSP themselves follows a framework. And the challenge with frameworks is, yeah, as I think it was Richard or Candid said earlier, they're not generally lots and lots of documents. You know, something like ISO 27001, you get 144 processes with just as many documents. That's when this is a breath of fresh air. And it is easier to communicate this to SMBs. It gives them guidance and a clear path and direction to attain cybersecurity framework.
This is all fantastic insight. Time is flying, though. I'm going to move on to what's my favorite section of these kind of conferences. It's like, let's not talk purely about academics here. Let's get down to some practical advice that we can offer for our MSP partners and other attendees here today. Claire, why don't you start off giving us a little color on the tip that you provided here?
So very often we hear from MSPs and from customers who really aim really high, and they have this fantastic vision, but they never actually get over the start line. And that's because the vision is probably so complex, and they actually want to achieve perfection. And rather than go on a journey, they try and sort of deliver everything in one go. So I think having an iterative approach is really makes a difference. And it's better to make some progress than no progress. So accept that you can't do everything at once, and just take it step by step.
Fantastic. Richard, I like your quote. Tell us some more about it.
It's not my quote. I should say, James, you know, this is a very famous quote in the industry. What can be measured can be managed. But I think this is super important for MSPs to have something to track their progress towards, some benchmark. It's easy, isn't it, to just get, as Claire was saying, to be drawn in numerous different directions, thinking that everything's got to be done at once. What a framework like this does is give you a benchmark to say what progress are you making, to highlight what's the priority, and to move towards that. So again, all aspects of MSP business should be measured so they can be managed, and this framework is a great way to measure that progress.
Fantastic. William, give us a little elucidation on your recommendation here.
Well, this is really for MSPs themselves to look at how they develop a security lifecycle with their clients, and think of this as a continuous lifecycle, starting at the assessment where you actually analyze what's going on inside the environment, looking at people, processes, technology, moving across to your design phase where you're, once you understand more about the posture, security posture of the client, you can actually then start designing their policy framework, the process framework, and the technology required as to underpin that. And then it's the implementation phase, which, you know, that's where the MSPs start to make the money, where they implement the hardware and the software. But what people seem to forget these days is the management phase is incredibly important, because most of these tools that are sold, I mean, we talked earlier about the number of products out there. You know, if you look at 20 controls and over 300 vendors per control, how does an SMB make a decision? And that's what we're there to do. So the ability to manage that's important as well. And then after you start managing, it's important to start to go back to assessing, because we have to show that we are improving, and this continuous improvement, which is part of a cybersecurity framework and structure. Thanks.
Thanks for that, William. Candid, I feel like the Acronis guy's gotten short shrift here a little bit. That's apologize for that, but I know you've got some great insight here and a very pithy aphorism there. Tell us a little bit more about your thoughts.
Yeah, I think my comment goes into the same direction that Claire already mentioned, right? Many organizations are a bit overwhelmed when they first look at one of those security frameworks, and then probably close it again and give up. But you do not have to create a huge project covering everything from the start, which again, probably would fail anyway. So just go and pick one or two of the core fields, for example, asset management or disaster recovery, and then grow from there. So use the available resources to map your mission objectives, and then assess where you currently stand, and then learn which practice you can actually apply on top of it to move you to the next tier to get more resilient, right? And once you finish that, then you can move to the next one and start assessing again and again, and therefore gradually grow. And I think that's the goal in the end.
That's great stuff. There's nothing like hearing that perspective for someone who's actually implemented it on a large scale, like with the Swiss government. All right, I wanted to move to audience Q&A here. Attendees, please continue to submit questions via the Q&A. My producers have curated a few ones that seem to have been asked by more than one attendee, but we commit that if we don't get to your question today, that we will follow up directly with you to make sure you get some answers. So I'm going to spread these around a little bit because we don't have a ton of time. Claire, let me present this first one to you. What barriers do you see to an MSP adopting NIST for MSPs and bringing it to their clients. What percentage of MSPs do you think are using it already?
I think some of this I've actually covered in previous answers, but fundamentally, in a lot of cases, it can be misconception. And I think that's of security frameworks generally. So these can be that they're too complicated, too difficult, or that it's very difficult to get senior management buy-in, perhaps because of cost. But again, it comes back to this modular approach and demonstrating, perhaps with a small part, that it can be efficiently delivered. And then how many MSPs do I think have already adopted NIST? I would probably guess outside North America, I'm guessing about 20%, but I think that's me being super positive. But what I can say is we are seeing that rapidly changing. As the risk increases, we are seeing more importance placed on being part of these kind of processes. So I would say it's on a rapid increase, but it's difficult to say, but my guess would be an uplifting 20%.
Yeah, that's not bad. Well, we have some room to improve and potentially help our partners with marketing and sales tool support, which I know we're going to do. That's part of my job.
James, can I chip in on something that Claire said earlier that I think is super important? Claire, you mentioned about non-segmented networks versus segmented, and I know it's a sort of a geeky topic, James, but I think this is super important. My background was in corporate IT, which predominantly, due to the size of the businesses, relied on segmented networks. Yep. The vast majority of MSPs that I see have non-segmented networks just because, they've got so many clients to look after. That means if the network's compromised by malware, the malware has access to everything. So I love Claire's advice about, MSPs, even at the SMB level, need to start considering segmenting their client's network, different zones, perhaps finance, HR, customer support. You can do it with Wi-Fi zones for Internet of Things devices and so on. I think that actually could be a barrier to people adopting NIST because that's quite a shift in mentality for MSPs. But I think it's so important that I jumped in and thought I had to back Claire up on that one.
Certainly part of our advice to customers about thwarting worm-enabled ransomware, for instance, which it can spread like wildfire across a network with just one person clicking on the wrong email. All right, let me move on. The moderator talked about the 5 functions of NIST. Can you give some specific examples of how Acronis Cyber Protect maps into these functions specifically? That's clearly one for the vendor guy. Candid, can you take that?
Sure. I mean, you already talked about the 5 functions at the beginning, right? So it's identify, protect, detect, response, and recover. So let's start with identify. The Acronis Cyber Protect has a vulnerability assessment built in. So you can, of course, automatically detect if any of your workload machines are missing some Microsoft patches or might not have the newest Firefox browser. And this definitely helps to identify potential issues for the future. The next one is protect. So Acronis is, of course, famously known for the good data backup, but there's also the option to install remotely any agent on machines which are not protected in your environment. In detect, of course, a huge focus is on detecting malware, like ransomware or info stealers. And it's not something which is actually new to us, right? Acronis has been blocking ransomware for about 5 years already. So we use all the artificial intelligence, machine learning supported detections, and behavior-based analysis, which actually allows us to beat a lot of the security products in terms of detection rates which are out there. And then once you have something, next stage is response, which you can either automatically quarantine or delete the malware, or you can, of course, patch any of the vulnerabilities that you found earlier, right? So helping you to respond to the threat. And then last but not least, it's about the recovery phase. So that's where disaster recovery of the backup comes in place, but it also contains actually additional information for the forensic teams. Like, for example, we integrated full memory dumps, which can help you figure out what's actually going on. And I mean, I could go on, but in terms of time, let's keep it here. Those are just a few examples of what the Acronis Cyber Protection can offer to cover all those 5 NIST functions from one single console.
Spoken like someone who has actually spent a lot of time working with this stuff recently. All right, let's move on here. Audience member asks, we're familiar with many other security standards and frameworks for best practices. Is NIST really the de facto standard? All right, so William, I know you have broad experience across a number of frameworks, like notably ISO 27000. Maybe you can comment on where NIST stands relative to the world of frameworks.
Yeah, I think it's for a lot of people, it's a choice of, do you like Coke or do you like Pepsi as to which framework you're going to select and what you're most familiar with. When I look at the different frameworks, I see 2700 is basically policy and process, and it's a less technical framework than some others. And the SIS controls are just those are things that we put in place to get results. From a NIST framework perspective, I think it from my perspective, it puts the organizer into your organization. It definitely takes away the complexity of frameworks. It doesn't just look at it from a control perspective like so many other frameworks do. It does look at it from a risk perspective. And that's why I'm not saying it's the best framework. I'm still, hearts to hearts, I'm still always going to be a 27002, 27001 person. But I do like the NIST framework, and I think it is very difficult to put 27001 into an SMB. It's a very expensive process. Even just to comply to it's expensive. So to have something like NIST that we can overlay, from the UK perspective, overlay over Cyber Essentials, absolutely perfect platform to give them security moving forward. That's my perspective.
That's fantastic. All right, we're just about out of time for Q&A here. Let me throw one more out here. Given that NIST really originated with the US government, does it have credibility in Europe, Middle East, Africa? Richard, why don't you start?
Sure. Yeah, I would say absolutely yes is the short answer to it, because businesses are businesses, whichever geography they're doing. However, for the UK-based MSPs, I would encourage you to go and check out the National Cybersecurity Centre. They've got a cyber assessment framework. But I absolutely love William's advice. Whichever framework that you look at, and I'd encourage you to take a look around, implement one and go with it, because these help you raise your standards and help clients to raise their standards. So this is not to say which is the best standard, to make MSPs aware that they don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are standards out there that they can implement to make their business and their client's business more safe and secure. Don't reinvent the wheel.
Well, I wish I had another half an hour with this panel to get a little deeper into this, but we are close to the end of our time here. Again, audience, we'll follow up if we didn't get to your question. Apologize for that. So I'd like to hand it back to Gaidar to take us home here.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Claire, William, Richard, and Candid. It was a very interesting panel, and what I see in questions in chat that attendees suggest that we host those events more often. So it definitely makes sense. So just a recap and some resources, just a reminder for some people who joined later, haven't seen that slide. So some resources are here, and you can get the trial, and also feel free to reach out to us to get the demo and individual consultation on deploying Cyber Cloud and Acronis Cyber Protect. Just to recap the panel, we were listening about the NIST framework and the ways to implement it. So definitely NIST framework can be used to assess your current security posture and improve your security posture, but also it can be used as a sales tool and the tool to explain to your customers why they need to deploy certain solutions, and specifically cyber protection, because that way you can have a conversation with your customers about the security, and appealing to the framework usually helps to structure this conversation and explain to customers the value of security. So with that, I'm wrapping up the session, and I have just a few things to do. So first of all, I want to highlight a few things that are currently available to service providers. So we still have the beta version of Acronis Cyber Protect available, so you can register and start testing it right now. As we speak, we're actually rolling out the production version, and some partners already got the early access to it. So in April, it will be available to all service providers across all the regions in all data centers. So you'll have Acronis Cyber Protect, you can deploy it now. Actually, it can be coming to your data center even today. So if you want to test it right now, sign up, or you'll get access to the production version, and our team will reach out to you and show you and notify you about the availability. A few programs that we have to support you during this unprecedented time. So we received a lot of requests from service providers and feedback about the current situation, that everybody needs secure file sync and share. Lots of new customers need add backup capabilities, and everybody's interested in Acronis Cyber Protect. So what we did to address the situation is, first of all service providers are getting Cyber Files Cloud for free. So we're not charging for any usage of that service, secure file sync and share, until end of July. And for all the new backup customers that you're adding to the Acronis Cyber Backup Cloud, we're not charging for it till the end of July either, because we understand that SMBs were not prepared for this situation, so they may not be willing to pay now, and they don't have the budget, so we have it there. And also for Acronis Cyber Protect, that was another feedback from partners who got the early access, is that a lot of customers want to step up in their security posture, but they were not budgeting for higher spend. So what we're doing is we're making Acronis Cyber Protect available at the same price as Acronis Cyber Backup. So you can onboard customers faster on this new solution. Now we have to accommodate to this reality where we do virtual events instead of physical events. And I believe that it was a great event based on the feedback I see in the chat and questions. And thank you very much for this feedback. And I believe we'll be hosting more sessions like that. And feel free to reach out to us and ask questions and suggest topics that you want us to cover in those events. So thank you very much. Thank you for coming, and stay safe.